Hi, everyone, and welcome to my very inspirationally named talk about building the API that you want to see in the world. So, like the previous speakers, I'm going to be speaking to you about GraphQL, which is going to be great for the buzzword bingo, because I'm going to say the word GraphQL like 100 times, so get into it. And this is not going to be a deep dive into how GraphQL works, because thankfully the previous speakers already explained that. This is going to be a talk about the problems that GraphQL can solve in the real world, in real applications, and some actual use cases for GraphQL. So I'm going to be talking about why I chose to use GraphQL along with my team. And I'm going to be sharing a story of liberating an application from the grips of a third-party API and finding happiness with GraphQL. So I am a software engineer at Condé Nast International in London, which is a publishing company. I organize a thing called Node Girls. I love GraphQL, and you can tweet me here if you want to tweet me about Node or GraphQL. And I'm going to be talking about GraphQL in two ways. First of all, I'm going to be talking about my experience of GraphQL, why I used it, why I'm so obsessed with it. And after that, I'm going to be talking about why you might want to use GraphQL and some use cases that I think are compelling. So we're going to start with my GraphQL story. And I'm going to give you some context first so you understand the application that I'm going to be talking about. So Condé Nast International, where I work, we are a publishing company, and we publish magazines and also look after some pretty well-known brands that you might have heard of, like GQ and Vogue magazine. These are the websites that I build with my team at Condé Nast. And GQ is not a magazine about GraphQL, even though I wish that it was. I'm lobbying for that internally. And this is the beautiful Vogue website that we've built, and this is currently powered by GraphQL in production. But this was not always the case, and I'm going to show you the journey that we went on to using GraphQL. So this is what the app used to look like. First of all, we were using an API for the content management system that our editors use to write their content. So we're not speaking directly to a database. We are using the API of this CMS, which was an internally built CMS, as CMSs often are, but thinking about it like a third-party API. And we still use this same API as one of our data sources. So initially, our application looked a bit like this. So it was a full-stack Node React app with server-side rendering. We spoke directly to the content management system API and put the data in Redux and rendered the beautiful Vogue website, which is, I think, a fairly standard architecture. But we had some problems with this approach. And we sat down at the end of last year after working with this structure for quite a few months, and we talked about the things that we liked about our code base and the things that we didn't like about our code base. And these are some of the problems that we came up with, which might sound familiar to you. Here we go. OK, so the first problem was that a lot of our components were specifically tied to the API response. So this is kind of a dramatic example. It wasn't all this bad. But imagine a title component where we need to render the title for an article. Instead of passing in just the props that our components would need, in a lot of cases, we were passing in literally the entire API response for a page to our components, which is not a good idea. Why is this bad? Well, if the API changes, then you have to update your components. So if the API developer changes the name of the title field to head, for example, then you have to rewrite your component. It's also less readable because it's not really clear what data your component needs. So when I'm a new developer and I look at this component for the first time, it's not clear to me what data I need to give this component in order to render it successfully. Our components knew way too much about their context. And by context, I mean where the data comes from, the structure that it's fetched in, and all the data that's available everywhere in the application. Ideally, we would have a few components that know about the context, while most of them have no idea what's happening outside their little component cells. So there's the theory of presentational versus container components, which is sort of the ideal. So the presentational components should know nothing about context. They have no state or dependencies. They just take in data and display it with no idea what's happening outside of themselves. So if we were to refactor the title component to be more presentational, it would look like this. It takes in just the text, nothing more, and definitely not the entire API response. Meanwhile, container components, they do know about context. They're sometimes generated by higher order components, and they're the components that provide the data to the presentational components. So a good example from our code base would be the article page component, which renders the article page. So it gets all the data, but it renders smaller presentational components, and it only gives them the data that they actually need. Like the title just gets the title text, the byline just gets the author, etc. Unfortunately, we did not enforce this strictly enough, and a lot of our components knew way too much about their context and the world around them, and it was very sad. In an ideal world, I think even container components would not know about the third-party API. More on this later. Basically, our components needed a major refactoring. Our second problem was that we sent a lot of data that we weren't using to the client. If you look at this beautiful, horrifying screenshot, this is all the data that we would get back for a single article if you go to the article endpoint in the API. As you can see, there's a lot of data, and I'm very sad to say that a good proportion of this actually made its way onto the client, and we were probably using less than 50% of it, way less than 50%. Why is this bad? First of all, confusing clutter. We don't need all of this data, so why is it there? It can also affect performance, because the browser is downloading unnecessary stuff. And it could be a security risk, because what if the API developer introduces a sensitive field because we're not validating? We could end up with password exposed to our client because we're not filtering the data. Moral of the story is we should not be sending all of this data to the client, and we were aware of this. Third problem is if we switched data sources, we would have to completely rewrite our entire application, because pretty much everything in our application was very closely tied to the API. That was from our components, to our analytics, to our routes, to our metadata. If we switched content management system to, say, WordPress, we would have to throw away our app and probably completely rewrite it. Why is this bad? Well, technology changes, and your application should be resilient. And if you work on a commercial project, it is a business risk to couple your application so tightly to a third-party service. We needed to consciously decouple. Problem number 4. The API was difficult to work with. It had some quirks that we didn't understand because we weren't the ones that built it. And I want to say that I think this is the case with all third-party APIs, or pretty much all of them. I don't think that the API that we were using was specifically bad or worse than the average API. In fact, it was probably better than a lot of APIs. But there are just some common issues that you experience when using third-party APIs. Because third-party APIs are not built with our specific use case in mind. Outrageous, I know, that everyone doesn't tailor everything for me. Here are some of the problems. So field names did not always make sense to us. Some of the field names were some kind of obscure publishing jargon that consistently confused new developers joining the team. There was also so much data, way more than we needed, as evidenced by this screenshot of death. And some of that data was not in the format that we required. Once again, outrageous. So this is the body of an article, and it would come back to us in Markdown, which is very convenient for the content management system to store the body in Markdown. But for us, it was inconvenient because we had to convert it into a format that we could actually render on the page inside our React application. There was also not always documentation, which is a common issue. So we didn't always know what query params we could use, what fields we would get back, what data we could request when we needed a new feature, what endpoints to use. And I mean, documentation is hard when it's done by humans, so I'm not going to blame the API developer necessarily for this. Third-party APIs will just never be perfect, but we needed to work better with the API that we were using inside of our application. The final issue that we experienced was that we were fetching data in really complicated ways from deep trees in the API every time we needed to use it, which just stresses me out as a sentence. There's a lot of words. So that was stressful. So imagine we need to render an article about Meghan Markle, which we have to do a lot on the Vogue websites. These are all the different requests that we would have to make in order to render an article about Meghan Markle. First of all, we look up the Meghan Markle article. We look up the publish history, because we need some specific dates for the analytics. We look up the contributor to find out more about her. We look up the fashion category, because we need the slug to render the little button to go to the category. We also display recommendations at the bottom of an article, so we need to look up recommendations for Meghan Markle. But that only gives us back a list of IDs, so then we have to look up every single one of those articles individually. Yeah. And then we had to smush all of it together and try and render this Meghan Markle article. Why is this bad? Well, it was cognitive overload trying to remember where to get which data every time we needed it. We had to navigate really complex relationships between objects, and we had to make multiple requests in our main application to get the data that we wanted every time that we needed it. And we were server-side rendering, but if you do this client-side, it's definitely not performant. It's also harder to debug, because when you have this whole chain of events, when something goes wrong, it's really hard to track down where the problem is. There's a lot to deal with, and we had a lot of issues. So we decided to solve these problems. And what we did was we had a spike, where we spent a week prototyping different solutions and approaches to try and improve how our code base was structured. The first approach was a refactor based purely on the domain-driven design pattern. So that was just a pattern that we were following. And the other was using GraphQL. And as you can probably guess, we decided to go all out and use GraphQL after that week. So if you remember, this is what our application looked like before. And all the business logic was happening in our React application in and around the React components. When we refactored the application, we essentially added a GraphQL layer that sat in between the main application and the third-party API. And all the business logic moved to that layer. As you can see from here, we used Apollo for that. And here's what GraphQL actually gave us. So firstly, it gave us instant documentation, which is a beautiful thing, because the GraphQL ecosystem has tools that automatically generate documentation from your schema. So there's tools like GraphQL or GraphQL Playground, which are kind of like Postman for REST if you've used that, where you can try out API requests before you add them in your application. This is a screenshot of GraphQL Playground. You can see I'm trying out a query on the left. But also, there's this nice little pop-out tab called Schema. Shows me all the queries I can make, the arguments I can include, and what data I can ask for, including all the fields and their types. And if they're more complex types, I can click on that because it's interactive, and it will show me all the fields for that type too. It's honestly a beautiful thing. So our documentation is now actually useful and stays up to date with pretty much no effort from a human, because it's automatically generated from our schema, and we don't have to do anything to maintain that. We now know for sure what data we can request for our client-side application, which makes feature development a lot easier. Second benefit is that we no longer have to fetch data with multiple requests inside our main application. So if you remember the Meghan Markle malarkey that we went through earlier, now we just make one query. Instead of making 10 different requests, we just write a list of the data that we want for the Meghan Markle page. We say I want the ID, the body, the contributors, the tags. For each tag, I want the name and the slug. You just write it all in a list, and you just make a single query. So now we get the data in a really clear, consistent way. I will say that we still have to make the same requests, but these now happen in the GraphQL layer, and our React application does not have to know about it, because it's shielded by the GraphQL layer. And our lives are a lot easier now that we only have to think about a single query. Another benefit that we found with GraphQL, which I didn't really expect, is that it encouraged really good patterns of structuring our app. Of course, good is subjective, but here's what it meant to us. It meant that we started fetching only the data that we actually needed to render a page. We stripped all the business logic out of our components and finally had true separation of concerns. We used field names that actually made sense instead of using the ones that the API gave us. Our UI is no longer tied to the API. And as a disclaimer here, I want to say that we could have done this without GraphQL, because if we were more disciplined developers, we could have avoided some of these problems in the first place. We could have just written our components better in the first place, but we didn't. And there are programming patterns that encourage these principles, but what we found is that so there are things like domain-driven design and hexagonal architecture, like traditional programming patterns. But we found that GraphQL enforces these patterns without requiring developers to police it themselves. We found that GraphQL allows you to follow these patterns without having to think about it. Another benefit is that we now have the assurance that if we ever need to change our data source, most of our application will not be affected. So imagine the scenario where Condé Nast wants to switch its content management system to WordPress. So this is what our application looks like. We're speaking to the API via this GraphQL layer. And if we switch to WordPress, the React application is no longer speaking directly to the data source, it's speaking to GraphQL. So the React application is effectively shielded from this change. Changing data sources will only affect the GraphQL layer, which shields the React application. And the impact is limited to updating the functions that resolve the data for each field in the schema. So the API that we use might completely be rewritten or changed, or there might be new APIs, but our application will be resilient. And we can now react more easily to technology changes, and our application is not going to be devastated. So that's why we used GraphQL, and that's what it gave us. But I think lots of people think GraphQL is cool, but they might not have an actual use case for it yet. So I'm going to give you some use cases that I think are compelling and that might give you an excuse to try out GraphQL. OK, the first one is that you have a set of data that needs to serve multiple applications. So imagine a scenario where we have one API, our content management system API, and we need to use that same data source for two applications, the Vogue web application and the Vogue native app. OK, so I think GraphQL is product-friendly, by which I mean I think it has a lower barrier to entry for new consumers to an API, because it reduces the burden on consumers to perform logic. In a previous life, this is what we might have done. Those two Vogue applications might separately speak to the content management system API, and the business logic of gluing together all the requests and embedding objects in each other would have to happen in two places. But now, with GraphQL, if we put a GraphQL layer on top of that third-party API, then all the business logic happens once, and both applications can benefit from it. And you can build the API that you want to see in the world, can build an API that you actually like, that arranges things in a way that makes sense to you, and you can use that instead. GraphQL does not enforce a specific way to consume an API, which I think is great for building products. It gives consumers the flexibility to request data in the way that they want it. So imagine that we want to render a beauty category page in both the web application and the native app. So on the website, we might make a query that looks like this. So we say we want the beauty category, and we want 10 articles, and for each article, we want the title and an image. And we just say what we want. Then in the native application, we also might want to render a beauty category page. But because it's a native app, maybe we don't want articles. Maybe we just want images. In a life before GraphQL, we would probably be burdened with those articles as well, because they would come back at the beauty category endpoint. But because we're using GraphQL, we can just ask for what we want, and we won't get anything else. So your applications can be totally different, but they can seamlessly use the same set of data. Another use case that I think is interesting is that you might be building an application that uses multiple data sources. So another scenario is that Condé Nast might introduce an extra data source like a shoes API for a feed of shoes on the homepage. I'm not a product manager, I don't know. So here we have a website, and it needs to speak to two different APIs. So we have the Rainbow Shoes API and the Pink Content Management System API, and it needs to speak to both of those. So you can build a GraphQL layer to fetch data from all these different sources, and the React application won't know where the data is coming from. It will only interact with GraphQL. You can combine data from anywhere, but only interact with a single interface. And I want to say that GraphQL and REST are not mutually exclusive. You can use them both at the same time, and you don't have to deprecate all of your REST APIs just because you're using GraphQL. You can get data from lots of different places, including REST APIs, and you can put it all together in the GraphQL layer. You could get data from REST APIs, other GraphQL APIs, a database, a JSON file in your system, a tweet, an S3 bucket, like wherever you want. And your React application is just going to speak to the GraphQL layer. So behind the scenes, the GraphQL layer is getting the data from all those different places. But your React app, all it knows is that it can now get information about shoes, which it couldn't do before. It doesn't make a distinction between where that data comes from. And your resolver functions are going to handle all of the complication behind the scenes. It's all going to happen there. Meanwhile, on the front end, you're living the sweet GraphQL life. Yeah. A third reason to use GraphQL is you want to enforce some structure in your code base. I showed how that really helped us earlier. I think that GraphQL encourages some good habits. Once again, good is subjective. But for us, that means that it will help you to separate your concerns, and it will encourage you to remove logic specific to third-party APIs from your client application. Another reason to use GraphQL is because it's fun and everybody else is doing it. And I don't think this is the only reason you should use a tool, but I think combined with some of the other great things about GraphQL, it's another reason that you should look into GraphQL as a thing for your projects. That is all. Thank you. You can tweet me here. And I want to say that I have some really deluxe stickers which say my code is in vogue. So if you want one of those stickers, I can give one to you. Thank you.